The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like dying insects, casting harsh shadows across the cracked linoleum floor of Roosevelt High's third-floor mathematics classroom. Marcus Williams hunched deeper into his desk chair, the metal legs wobbling beneath him as he tried to make himself invisible. His worn Converse sneakers, held together with duct tape and hope, barely grazed the floor. A constant reminder that even the furniture in this place wasn't made for someone like him. "Now, class." Mrs. Henderson's voice cut through the stifling October air like a blade. "Let's see who's been paying attention to our advanced algebraic concepts." Her pale fingers, adorned with rings that caught the light mockingly, drummed against the whiteboard. 20 years of tenure had given her the confidence of untouchability, and she wielded it like a weapon against students she deemed unworthy of her time. Marcus felt her gaze settle on him before she even spoke his name. It was always him. Never Jessica with her designer backpack. Never Tyler, whose father donated to the school's athletic program. Always Marcus, sitting in the back row where the textbooks were missing pages and the dreams came to die. "Marcus Williams," she announced, her voice dripping with theatrical sweetness that fooled no one. "Come solve this equation for us." The classroom fell silent except for the whispered snickers that followed him everywhere. Marcus's stomach clenched. Not from fear, but from the familiar ache of hunger that had been his companion since breakfast became a luxury his family couldn't afford. He stood slowly, his second-hand jeans hanging loose on his thin frame, and walked toward the board where Mrs. Henderson had scrawled an equation that made several students gasp. Integral caret infinity x superscript 3e caret x superscript 2 dx equals? "If you can solve this, Marcus," she said, her smile sharp as broken glass, "I'll marry you." The laughter erupted like a dam bursting. 28 voices joined in cruel harmony, their mockery echoing off the water-stained walls. But Marcus didn't hear them. His dark eyes, intelligent beyond his 17 years, studied the integral with an intensity that made Mrs. Henderson's smile falter for just a moment. Behind his calm exterior, Marcus's mind raced through substitution methods, gamma functions, and integration by parts. The equation wasn't impossible, it was elegant, beautiful even. His hands trembled as he reached for the marker, not from nervousness, but from the electric recognition of a problem he could solve. Marcus stared at the equation, his mind automatically breaking it down into manageable components. But Mrs. Henderson's expectant smirk told him she'd already decided his fate. He set the marker down without writing a single symbol. "I thought so," she said, her voice carrying the satisfaction of confirmed prejudice. "Perhaps stick to basic arithmetic, Marcus." The laughter followed him back to his seat, but Marcus barely heard it. His thoughts drifted to the previous evening, when he'd sat at the kitchen table in their cramped two-bedroom apartment, working through calculus problems in the margins of yesterday's newspaper. His grandmother Rosa had shuffled over in her worn slippers, setting down a cup of tea that smelled like hope and sacrifice. "Mijo, what are all these numbers?" she'd asked, her weathered fingers tracing the elegant equations he'd scrawled between headlines about city budget cuts and rising crime rates. "Just math, abuela," he'd whispered, not wanting to wake his younger sister sleeping on the couch. But Rosa's eyes, sharp despite her 73 years, had studied his work with the intensity of someone who recognized brilliance even when she couldn't understand it. "This looks important," she'd said simply, and Marcus had felt something crack open in his chest. At home, his mind mattered. At school, it was invisible. "Marcus," Mrs. Henderson's voice snapped him back to the present. "Since you're clearly daydreaming, perhaps you can tell us the answer to this simple problem?" She'd written 2x plus 5 is equal to 13 on the board, an insult disguised as instruction. "4, Marcus said quietly. "Lucky guess," she replied without missing a beat, erasing his correct answer as if it had never existed. "Anyone else want to show Marcus how it's actually done?" The pattern was always the same. When he answered correctly, which was always, it was luck, cheating, or coincidence. When he struggled to focus through hunger and exhaustion, it confirmed every stereotype she carried about kids from his neighborhood. Each dismissal was a small death, a systematic erasure of his intellectual worth that accumulated like poison in his bloodstream. Marcus opened his notebook, where complex theorems lived alongside grocery lists and unpaid bills, and began to doubt the very mind that had once felt like his greatest gift. That evening, Marcus found Rosa hunched over the kitchen sink, her arthritic hands scrubbing grease from a Tupperware container that had seen better decades. The apartment smelled of rice and beans, again, but also of the industrial disinfectant that clung to her uniform after 12-hour shifts cleaning downtown office buildings. "How was school, Mijo?" she asked without turning around, her voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who'd been awake since 4 a.m. Marcus dropped his backpack by the door, watching her shoulders move with practiced efficiency. At 73, Rosa Martinez had the hands of someone who'd spent 50 years making other people's lives easier. First as a seamstress in factories that paid pennies, now as a janitor in buildings where she was invisible to the people whose trash she emptied. "Mrs. Henderson gave us another impossible problem today," he said, settling at the wobbly table where he did homework by lamplight because the overhead fixture had burned out months ago. Rosa dried her hands on a dish towel that had been white once, then sat across from him. Her dark eyes, clouded with cataracts but still fierce, studied his face with the intensity of someone who'd learned to read disappointment in the set of shoulders and the curve of mouths. "Tell me about impossible," she said. Marcus pulled out his notebook, showing her the integral from class. Rosa couldn't read the symbols, but she understood struggle. She'd grown up in Texas when separate meant unequal, when brilliant minds like hers were channeled into service jobs because that's all the world would allow. "You know this one, don't you?" she asked, recognizing the spark in his eyes. "Yes, but—" "No buts, Marcus. I clean toilets so you can solve problems like this. Don't let them make you small." At school the next day, Marcus sat alone in the cafeteria, picking at a free lunch that tasted like institutional neglect. 3 tables away, he heard Tyler's voice cutting through the noise. "Did you see Marcus trying to act smart yesterday? Dude lives in the projects and thinks he's Einstein." The laughter that followed felt like a physical blow, each chuckle another reminder that his zip code was a scarlet letter, his poverty a weapon they wielded against his intelligence. Marcus pushed his lunch tray away, the mockery still ringing in his ears, when the cafeteria doors swung open. A young black woman in a crisp blazer walked through, her natural hair styled in a professional twist that somehow managed to look both authoritative and approachable. She scanned the room with the practiced eye of an educator, her gaze lingering on Marcus's isolated table. Ms. Patricia Johnson had been substitute teaching at Roosevelt High for 3 weeks, long enough to recognize the social hierarchies that govern teenage life but not long enough to become numb to their cruelty. At 26, she carried her master's degree in mathematics like armor against a world that questioned her qualifications at every turn. The next morning, she stood outside Mrs. Henderson's classroom during 3rd period, clipboard in hand for what the administration called peer observation. Through the small window, she watched Mrs. Henderson write another complex equation on the board. "Marcus?" Mrs. Henderson called out with theatrical sweetness. "Care to embarrass yourself again?" Ms. Johnson's grip tightened on her pen as she watched Marcus's shoulders tense. She'd seen this dance before, the systematic destruction of a student's confidence disguised as academic rigor. "Actually," Ms. Johnson said, stepping into the classroom, "I'd love to see how students approach advanced integration techniques." Mrs. Henderson's smile faltered. Of course, Marcus was just about to demonstrate his limitations. But Ms. Johnson was already walking toward Marcus's desk. "What's your approach to this problem?" she asked quietly, her voice carrying none of the condescension he'd grown accustomed to. Marcus looked up, startled by genuine interest. "Substitution method," he whispered. "Let u equal x squared." "Show me," she said, handing him her pen. For the first time in months, Marcus stood and walked to the board with purpose. His hand moved confidently across the whiteboard, each step of the solution flowing like poetry. When he finished, the classroom was silent. "Brilliant," Ms. Johnson said, and meant it. Mrs. Henderson's face had turned the color of old brick. "Lucky guess," she muttered. "No," Ms. Johnson replied firmly. "That's mastery." After class, She found Marcus at his locker. "We need to talk," she said. "Meet me in room 204 during lunch." That afternoon, Marcus sat across from Ms. Johnson in an empty classroom, his defenses still raised. "How long has this been happening?" she asked. "What do you mean?" "Marcus, I have a PhD in mathematics from MIT. I know genius when I see it, and I also know systematic suppression when I witness it." The words hung between them like a bridge Marcus was afraid to cross. "She's been teaching here for 20 years, he said finally. "Who's going to believe me?" Ms. Johnson leaned forward, her voice steady but urgent. "The question isn't who will believe you. The question is whether I'm willing to risk my career to make sure they have to." Ms. Johnson's words echoed in Marcus's mind for 3 days, until the quarterly parent-teacher conferences arrived like a storm he couldn't avoid. Rosa had taken the afternoon off, unpaid time she couldn't afford, and sat beside him in the plastic chair outside Mrs. Henderson's classroom, her cleaning uniform replaced by her one good dress, navy blue with small flowers that had faded from too many washings. "Mrs. Martinez," Mrs. Henderson began as they settled into the cramped conference space, her tone carrying the false warmth of someone performing charity. "Thank you for coming. I wanted to discuss Marcus's academic trajectory." Rosa's weathered hands folded in her lap, but Marcus caught the slight tremor that betrayed her nervousness. She'd never made it past 8th grade herself, and these conferences felt like trials where she was both defendant and witness. "Marcus shows some aptitude for basic mathematics," Mrs. Henderson continued, shuffling through papers with theatrical importance. "But I'm concerned he's being placed in courses beyond his capabilities. Advanced algebra, calculus, these require a certain foundation that, frankly, students from his background often lack." The words hit Marcus like physical blows, but it was Rosa's sharp intake of breath that made his chest tighten. "What do you mean, his background?" Rosa asked quietly, her accent thickening as it always did when she was upset. "Well, you understand. Single-parent household, economic disadvantages, the challenges of his neighborhood. I think Marcus would be much better suited for vocational training. Auto mechanics, perhaps, or food service. Practical skills for practical futures." The silence stretched like a taut wire. Marcus watched his grandmother's face transform, the deference melting away to reveal something fierce and unbreakable. "Mrs. Henderson," Rosa said, her voice steady as bedrock. "My grandson solves problems in his head that I cannot even read. He explains mathematics to me like poetry. You see his zip code and his clothes, but you do not see his mind." Mrs. Henderson's smile became patronizing. "Mrs. Martinez, I understand you want the best for Marcus, but false hope can be cruel. We must be realistic about—" "Realistic?" Rosa stood, her small frame somehow filling the room. "Realistic is working 3 jobs to keep him in school. Realistic is watching him study by streetlight when our power gets cut. Realistic is knowing my grandson is brilliant while you see only what you choose to see." Marcus stared at his grandmother, seeing her not as the tired woman who cleaned other people's messes, but as the warrior she'd always been. In that moment, something crystallized inside him, a decision that had been building since Ms. Johnson first believed in him. That night, he pulled out the integral Mrs. Henderson had mocked him with weeks ago. His hands no longer trembled as he began to work, each step deliberate and sure. If she wanted to see what impossible looked like, he would show her exactly what a boy from his background could accomplish. Marcus walked into 3rd period with Rosa's words echoing in his mind and 3 pages of meticulous calculations folded in his pocket. He'd worked until dawn, checking and rechecking every step, his grandmother's fierce dignity fueling each stroke of his pencil. Mrs. Henderson was already at the board, writing another problem designed to humiliate. She turned as Marcus approached her desk, his heart hammering against his ribs. "I solved it," he said quietly, unfolding the papers. She barely glanced down. "Solved what?" "The integral. From last month. The one you said was impossible." Mrs. Henderson's laugh was sharp as breaking glass. "Marcus, please. You obviously copied this from somewhere. Probably the internet." "Look at it," Marcus said, his voice stronger now. "Actually look at my work. I don't need to waste time on—" "Look at it." The words erupted from him with a force that surprised them both. The classroom fell silent, 28 pairs of eyes turning toward the unprecedented sight of Marcus Williams challenging authority. Mrs. Henderson's face flushed red. "How dare you raise your voice to me? This is exactly the kind of behavior I'd expect from—" "From what?" Marcus stepped closer, Rosa's courage flowing through his veins. "From someone like me?" The door opened, and Ms. Johnson entered, her timing perfect as always. She took in the scene. Marcus standing tall for the first time, Mrs. Henderson's defensive posture, the papers scattered between them. "What's happening here?" Ms. Johnson asked. "Marcus claims he solved the Gaussian integral I assigned weeks ago," Mrs. Henderson said dismissively. "Obviously impossible." Ms. Johnson picked up the papers, her eyes scanning Marcus's work. Her expression shifted from curiosity to amazement to something that looked like pride. "This is correct," she said quietly. "Every step. It's not just correct, it's elegant." Mrs. Henderson snatched the papers, her eyes moving frantically across the calculations. The silence stretched until truth became undeniable, hanging in the air like smoke that couldn't be cleared. "Well," she said finally, her voice hollow, "I suppose even a broken clock is right twice a day." But Marcus was no longer listening. He'd found his voice, and he wasn't going to lose it again. The broken clock comment hung in the air like a slap, but Marcus no longer flinched. He'd crossed a line he couldn't uncross, and the freedom felt both terrifying and exhilarating. As students filed out after the bell, whispers followed them like wildfire through Roosevelt High's corridors. Ms. Johnson stayed behind, her phone already recording as she documented the incident. "I need you to write down everything that just happened," she told Marcus. "Every word, every detail." By the end of the week, Principal Davis sat across from them in his office, a man caught between institutional loyalty and undeniable evidence. At 55, James Davis had navigated the politics of public education long enough to recognize a powder keg when he saw one. "These are serious allegations," he said, reviewing Ms. Johnson's detailed report. "Mrs. Henderson has been with us for 20 years. She's never had a formal complaint. Because students like Marcus learn not to complain," Ms. Johnson replied. "They learn to accept diminished expectations as normal." Davis rubbed his temples. The school board meeting was in 3 days, and this was exactly the kind of controversy that made superintendents nervous. "I'll need to investigate further." But word had already spread beyond the school's walls. Rosa had called her sister, who called her neighbor, who worked with the mother of another Roosevelt student. By Sunday, Marcus found himself in the basement of Mount Olive Baptist Church, surrounded by parents whose children had similar stories. "My daughter Keisha," said Mrs. Williams, her voice shaking with suppressed anger, "came home crying because Mrs. Henderson told her she'd never understand real mathematics like the other kids. My son Jerome stopped raising his hand in her class," added Mr. Thompson. "Said she made him feel stupid every time he tried." Marcus listened as story after story poured out. Years of microaggressions, lowered expectations, and systematic erosion of confidence. He realized his moment of courage had given others permission to speak their truth. But courage came with consequences. Mrs. Henderson's allies rallied around her, painting Marcus as a disrespectful troublemaker. Anonymous notes appeared in his locker. "Know your place. Uppity doesn't suit you." The school board meeting approached like a storm, and Marcus understood that standing up for justice meant standing in the eye of it, regardless of the cost. The auditorium at State University hummed with anticipation, its polished floors and gleaming walls a stark contrast to the cracked linoleum of Roosevelt High. Marcus Williams adjusted his navy blue tie, the first one he'd ever owned, purchased with money Rosa had saved from months of overtime shifts cleaning office buildings until her arthritic hands ached. 6 months had passed since the school board meeting that changed everything, and now he stood among the top mathematics students in the state, preparing for the final round of the academic excellence competition. "Contestant number 47, the moderator announced, her voice echoing through the packed auditorium, "Marcus Williams from Roosevelt High School." Marcus approached the podium with measured steps, his posture straight and confident. The equation projected on the massive screen behind him was formidable, a partial differential equation that would have sent his former self into a spiral of self-doubt. Now, it felt like greeting an old friend who'd come to test his growth. Del superscript 2u slash del t superscript 2 equals c superscript 2. Del superscript 2u slash del x superscript 2 plus del superscript 2u slash del y superscript 2 plus f, x, y, t. Behind him in the audience, Rosa sat in the front row wearing her best dress, the same navy blue with faded flowers she'd worn to confront Mrs. Henderson. Her weathered hands clutched a tissue, tears of pride threatening to spill, as she watched her grandson command the stage with the authority of someone who finally knew his worth. Beside her, Ms. Johnson, now permanently assigned to Roosevelt High after the district's comprehensive policy overhaul, watched with the fierce pride of someone who'd helped nurture a diamond from rough stone. This is a wave equation with a forcing function, Marcus began, his voice carrying clearly through the auditorium without a trace of the uncertainty that once plagued him. The solution requires separation of variables and Fourier analysis. As he worked through each methodical step, his mind wandered to the journey that had brought him here. Mrs. Henderson had been quietly reassigned to administrative duties after mandatory sensitivity training and a formal reprimand, though the bitterness in her eyes during their final encounter suggested the lessons hadn't penetrated her heart. New district policies now required documentation of all student interactions, regular bias training for faculty, and anonymous reporting systems for discriminatory behavior. The general solution takes the form of an infinite series, Marcus continued, his marker moving across the whiteboard with practiced precision. Each symbol he wrote felt like a small victory over every voice that had told him he wasn't smart enough, wasn't worthy enough, wasn't enough. Excellent work, the head judge said as Marcus completed his solution, the audience erupting in applause. That's a perfect score, bringing your total to the highest we've seen today. 3 hours later, Marcus stood on the same stage holding a trophy that caught the auditorium lights like captured starlight. But the real victory wasn't the gleaming medal in his hands. It was the transformation he felt in his bones, the unshakable knowledge that his mind was a gift no one could diminish. The following Monday, back at Roosevelt High, Marcus found himself in Ms. Johnson's classroom, now transformed into a space where every student's potential was recognized and nurtured. The walls displayed work from students of all backgrounds, their achievements celebrated equally. Motivational posters had been replaced with actual student accomplishments. David Rodriguez's algebra breakthrough, Keisha Williams's geometry proof, Jerome Thompson's calculus project. How does it feel? Ms. Johnson asked, gesturing to the competition trophy now displayed prominently on her desk alongside photos of all her students' successes. Like the beginning, Marcus replied thoughtfully. Not the end. A tentative knock at the door interrupted their conversation. A small ninth grader peeked in, his worn sneakers and nervous demeanor achingly familiar. Marcus recognized the look, the same desperate hope he'd once carried, mixed with the fear of being disappointed again. "Excuse me," the boy said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I heard you help kids with math problems." Marcus smiled, remembering his own desperate search for someone who believed in him. "What's your name?" "David. David Rodriguez. My algebra teacher says I'm not smart enough for advanced classes. She says kids from my neighborhood should focus on practical skills." The words hit Marcus like an echo from his past, but instead of pain, he felt purpose. He knelt to David's eye level, seeing his younger self in the boy's uncertain gaze, recognizing the spark of intelligence that others had tried to extinguish. "David, let me tell you something important," Marcus said, his voice gentle but firm. "Your worth isn't determined by their limitations. It's determined by your willingness to prove them wrong, one equation at a time." As David's face lit up with hope, Marcus understood that his real equation had nothing to do with mathematics. It was about transforming pain into purpose, silence into strength, and one student's courage into a legacy of change that would ripple through generations of young minds who deserved to know their brilliance mattered.